Okay, how many of you have read the book of Judges? Have you heard a church preach through it? No. Okay. Have you ever wondered why this book is rarely taught? Okay. Imagine you are driving on a highway with no speed limits, no lane markers, and no rules. Cars are swerving in every direction, drivers going whatever seems right to them. One speeds recklessly, another drifts aimlessly, and some stop altogether, causing chaos. Drivers are men and women, of course. You grip the wheel, unsure if you will make it safely. That's the world of Judges. A society with no moral compass, people doing whatever seemed right in their own eyes. Chaotic, violent, and broken people everywhere. The stories are so earthly, so primitive, and so violent that the church often ignores it altogether. However, if we examine closely, we will find that its story, though written 3,000 years ago, still reflects aspects of our own lives today. So be prepared. This book is raw, unsettling, and often disturbing. It tells of a nation got mad with sin and rebellion. The judges, the so-called heroes, are deeply flawed and morally compromised. They lie, they cheat, and even commit atrocities. Their efforts to save Israel become increasingly futile and less redemptive. It is a dismal and often discouraging narrative, but it feels so eerily familiar. The closing verse of Judges captures the essence of their time. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. A phrase that could just as easily describe the spirit of our age. We live in a time marked by moral relativism, where the lines between right and wrong are increasingly blurred. What is right for you must be right. What feels good must be correct, we are told. Our world, like that of the Israelites, is flooded with competing gods. The gods of wealth, celebrity, pleasure, ideology, and achievement. The parallels between their time and ours are striking. And the Israelites, rather than remaining faithful to the one true God, became entangled with surrounding nations. They intermingled not only with the people, but also with their pagan practices. Like them, we too face the daily choice of whether to follow God wholeheartedly or to blend in with the preferences and priorities of the culture around us. Judges is largely the story of how Israel failed in this task for over 350 years. How they repeatedly turned from knowing, loving, and obeying God to pursue their own desires. Does it sound familiar? And yet, amid this bleak history, there is a greater story behind told. A story not of human virtue, but of divine mercy. So friends, you will not find a collection of moral examples in this book. You will not find inspirational tales of courage and righteousness. Instead, you will find a God of astonishing patience, a God of long-suffering mercy who continues to work through broken, sinful, and rebellious people like the Israelites, like us. The book of Judges holds up a mirror to our own hearts. We can see ourselves in the Israelites, their compromises, their self-reliance, their failure to remain faithful. And in doing so, we are reminded of our desperate need for a Savior. And you will see that the true hero of this book is not Gideon, Samson, or Deborah. It is God. His relentless grace, His unwavering faithfulness, His redemptive purpose shine through the darkness. So as we journey through Judges, open your heart. Let us recognize the brokenness of the human condition, but also marvel at the mercy of a God who redeems in the midst of it. So may this difficult book challenge you, convict you, and ultimately lead you to a deeper awe for the one who remains faithful, even when we are not God. So, chapter 1, are you ready? Let me give you a bit of context. The dust had barely settled over the promised land. The sun hung low over the rolling hills of Canaan, casting a long shadows across the newly claimed territory. The Israelites, once wandering people, now stood in the land they had fought so hard to enter. Yet, despite their recent victories, a heavy uncertainty lingered in the air. Joshua, their bold and faithful leader, was dead. The one who had led them across the Jordan River, brought down the walls of Jericho, and pointed them again and again toward God's covenant, was no more. His absence left a void that weighed heavily on the nation. For years, they had relied on Joshua's clear direction. His voice had spoken God's commands with confidence, and his leadership had ensured they kept their eyes fixed on the Lord. Now, with Joshua gone, the people felt vulnerable. The battle was not yet over. There were still Canaanites, strongholds to conquer, and pagan influences to drive out. But without their leader, who would guide them? And so they did the only thing they knew to do. Verse 1. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who of us is going to go up first to fight against the Canaanites?" And their question revealed both the uncertainty and the dependence. Uncertainty because they were unsure how to move forward without Joshua. Dependence because they still recognized that their hope lay in God, not in their own strength. It was a pivotal moment, a crossroads between faith and fear. Would they continue to trust God as they had under Joshua, or would they allow doubt and compromise to take hold? The scene captures a nation in transition, standing on the edge of promise, filled with hope for victory, but also vulnerable without their leader, forced to rely on the only true commander they ever needed, God Himself. And you know what? Joshua's death is a subtle but significant reminder that new chapters in God's story are often marked by the earthly end of His servants. Exodus begins with the death of Joseph. Joshua opens with the death of Moses. And now Judges begins with the death of Joshua. Yet, Despite the passing of these great leaders, God's kingdom does not falter. It does not collapse when even his most influential servants are laid to rest. The work of God continues, carried forward not by the fame of human heroes, but by the enduring faithfulness of the Lord himself. And this, dear friends, we must not overlook. Our hope is not found in charismatic pastors, famous authors, popular YouTubers. Our help is in the name of the Lord alone, the one who remains sovereign and steadfast, no matter how many of his servants pass away. So God was with Israel, and they also had three distinct legacies to uphold. A firm foothold in the promised land, a covenant commitment to worship and obey Yahweh alone, a divine mandate to remove the remaining Canaanites from their lands. It was very clear. If the Israelites wanted victory, identity, and rest, they would have to be faithful and obedient to God. Their success depended not on their strength, but on their obedience. So in verse 1, they wisely sought God's strategy in proceeding against their foe. And then in verse 2, the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. And here God speaks in past tense, emphasizing that the victory is assured. It is as good as done. And then verse 3, and Judah said to Simeon, his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I, likewise, will go with you into the territory allotted to you. But wait a minute. Did God say Judah and Simeon shall go up? No. God clearly instructed Judah alone to lead the charge, right? Perhaps Judah thought it made sense militarily to join forces with Simeon, but spiritually it was an act of faithlessness. God's command was clear: Judah is to go. However, instead of trusting God fully, Judah relied on human reasoning. Their obedience was only partial, a halfway faith. So Simeon went with him, verse 4. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek at Bezek and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table, as I have done. So God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. At first glance, this passage seems brutal, quite disturbing. The Israelites capture Adoni-Bezek, who is the lord of Bezek, a Canaanite king, and mutilate him by cutting off his thumbs and his big toes. It is a harsh punishment. But what makes this scene particularly striking is Adoni-Bezek's own confession. He admits that he had done the very same thing to 70 other kings. Forcing them to scavenge for scraps beneath his table was his way of humiliating and crippling them. Now, as he suffers the same fate, he recognizes it is a divine justice. Now God has repaid me for what I have done. And this passage illustrates the principle of divine retribution, or principle of sowing and reaping. The idea that people often face the same kind of treatment they inflict on others. Adoni-Bezek's own words show that he clearly understands this. He offers no excuse, no self-justification. He sees that the hand of God delivering judgment. So friends, this is a powerful reminder of the biblical truth that we reap what we sow. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked for whatever one sows, that will he also reap. Adoni-Bezek had spent his life brutalizing others, but in the end he could not escape the justice of God. And it is worth noting that he likely believed he would never be held accountable for his cruelty. He had overpowered 70 kings, and no doubt assumed his power was secure. Yet, in God's perfect timing, judgment came. Dear friends, this should give us both a warning and a comfort. God's justice may seem delayed, but it is never denied. The wicked may prosper for a time, but their deeds will not go unpunished. When we see injustice around us, whether in personal situation or on a global scale, we can trust that God will make all things right in His time. And another key lesson from this passage is God's mercy amid judgment. Although Adoni-Bezek is captured and humiliated, he's not immediately executed. Instead, he's brought to Jerusalem, where he spends his final days. This may seem insignificant, but it reflects God's patience even toward the wicked. He's given time to reflection on his fate, recognize God's justice, and perhaps even repent. This reminds us that God is both just and merciful. Even the worst sinners have the chance to turn to Him. No matter how far we have fallen, God's mercy is still extended to us. Verse 8, and the men of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. And afterward, the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negev, and in the lowland. And Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron is formerly Kiriath Arba, that means city of four. And they defeated Sheshaiah and Aiman and Talmai. Literally, they wiped out a Canaanite confederation. At first glance, this can seem harsh, unsettling, wiping out the Canaanites, setting their cities on fire. But when we understand who the Canaanites were and the divine justice behind God's command, we will see that this was not cruelty. It was holiness and mercy at work. The Canaanites were the descendants of Canaan, the grandson of Noah. They were known for their well-fortified cities and advanced culture, but they were also infamous for the corruption and depravity. They were a deeply idolatrous people. Their religious practices were not merely misguided, they were appallingly wicked. They involved child sacrifice, where infants were burned alive to appease their gods. Their temples were filled with ritual prostitution and sexual immorality. And their society was marked by violence and cruelty. So God's command to wipe out the Canaanites may seem extreme. However, this was not an act of random brutality. It was divine judgment against a people whose wickedness had reached its full measure. So the Canaanites were not innocent victims. Their destruction was God's judgment for generations of unrepentant sin. And by the time of Judges, their corruption was complete. God's justice was both necessary and righteous. So, Judah, having won victories, continues to take their inheritance. And between the record of these victories, the narrator narrows to one spiritually brave family in Israel, the family of faithful Caleb. Verse 11. From there, they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sefer. And Caleb said, "He who attacks Kiriath Sefer and captures it, I will give him Axa, my daughter, for a wife." And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. And he gave him Axa, his daughter, for a wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she dismounted from her donkey. And Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Give me a blessing, since you have set me in the land of the Negev. Give me also springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. Caleb issued a challenge. Whoever conquers Kiriath Sefer, a fortified Canaanite city, will win the hand of his daughter, Axa. This may sound strange to us today, but in ancient times, such a reward was a symbol of honor and inheritance. Othniel, his nephew, who will become Israel's first judge, accepts the challenge, successfully captures the city, and receives Axa as his wife. But what is remarkable in this little story is the boldness and wisdom of Axa. She comes to her father. She dismounts from her donkey, a gesture in that culture indicating respect and formality. Caleb, her father, perhaps sensing she has a request, asks, "What can I do for you?" Axa makes a bold but thoughtful request. "Do me a special favor. Since you have given me the land in the Negev, give me also springs of water." The Negev was arid, dry region with little rainfall. Though she and Othniel had inherited land without a reliable water source, it would be difficult to cultivate and prosper. So Axa, rather than passively accepting a less than ideal inheritance, she wisely asked for more from her father. Caleb does not rebuke her boldness. Instead, he generously grants her request, giving her not just one spring, but both, upper and lower springs, and a sign of generosity and affection. This story carries a deeper spiritual significance, I believe. The land was dry and unfruitful, without water. And so are our lives without the living water of God's presence. John 7:37-38, Jesus says, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." Is your heart dry and barren? Are you spiritually thirsty? Are you in the Negev? Ask your father for spiritual water. Just as Axa did, you can come to your father in faith and ask him to fill you with rivers of living water. And this small passage may seem like a brief historical account, but it offers us a beautiful picture of faith, boldness, and love from the Father. So the conquest carried on, verse 16, and the descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of Psalms, which is Jericho, in the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negev near Arad. And they went and settled with the people. And Judah went with Simeon, his brother, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Sephat and devoted it to destruction. So the name of the city was called Hormah, that means wipe out. Judah also captured Gaza with its territory, and Askelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. So far, so good. The narrative is encouraging. They are literally wiping out the Canaanites from the land. But verse 19 jars. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country. But he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. At first glance, this verse seems confusing. The Lord was with Judah, so why did they fail? Was it because the Canaanites' iron chariots were simply too powerful? I don't think so. The failure wasn't due to a lack of strength, but a lack of faith. The people of Judah looked at the iron chariots and measured their own strength against the enemy, rather than trusting in God's strength. And this almost imperceptible failure in their narrative marks the beginning of Israel's failure and tragedy, which would continue for centuries to go. Israel would never be the same again. At the beginning of the chapter, things were looking promising. Judah was winning battles, defeating their enemies with God's help. In verse 4, they struck down 10,000 men at Vaca. In verse 8, they captured Jerusalem. In verse 11, Othniel and Asa's story was encouraging. They successfully fought against the Canaanites in Hebron and Debir. But then, suddenly, we hit verse 19, the turning point, and you will see. And despite God being with them, they stopped short of complete victory. And why? Why? Because they allowed human reasoning to override divine promises. Instead of trusting the God who had just given them multiple victories, they saw the iron chariots and faltered. Sight prevailed over faith. The contagion of half-hearted obedience, of half-belief in God's promises, spread like a virus. Verse 20. And Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the 3 sons of Anak. But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Verse 22. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please, show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." And he showed them the way into the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and called its name Luz. That is the name of this day. This passage opens with a positive note. The house of Joseph, representing the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, goes into battle against Bethel. The text specifically states the Lord was with them. As the house of Joseph scouted the city, they encountered a man from Bethel. Instead of relying fully on God for guidance, they make a deal with the man. They offer him mercy in exchange for inside information. While this may seem like a clever military tactic, it reveals a subtle compromise. By sparing the man and his family, they fail to carry out God's command for complete obedience in driving out the inhabitants. And after the battle, the man they spared fled to the land of the Hittites and built a new city, which he named Luz. This is a tragedy in disguise. The Israelites destroyed the old city of Luz, but by sparing this man, they unintentionally allowed it to rebuild elsewhere. The enemy they were meant to eliminate ended up re-establishing itself in a new location. What seems like mercy to this man results in long-term consequences. The pagan influence they were meant to drive out is preserved and revived. They allowed a small portion of the enemy to escape, and that small compromise eventually led to the establishment of another stronghold. Dear friends, do not compromise on what God has called you to remove from your life. Do not negotiate with idolatry. Don't align with the ways of the world. Don't tolerate gossip, lies, pride, or any form of sin. Do not deal with the enemy. When we make allowances for sin, even small ones, it can resurface in greater force. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. Colossians 3. We are called to deal ruthlessly with sin, not negotiate with it. And then Israel's failures continue. Verse 27. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ivrim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in the land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. And the reason implied in their compromise with the Canaanites is that it made more economic sense and required less effort to enslave them than to drive them out. Convenience trumps obedience. Verse 29, and Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol. So the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon or of Aslav or of Aksif or of Helva or of Aphik or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, so they lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and of Beth Anath became subject to forced labor for them. Can you see the pattern? They did not. A slow but steady decline of Israel's faith and obedience. What starts with victory and confidence eventually gives way to compromise, complacency, and ultimately spiritual defeat. The people of God become progressively weaker, not because their enemies are stronger, but because their faith grows smaller. Instead of obeying God's clear command to drive the Canaanites out completely, the Israelites compromised by enslaving them. At first, it seems like a clever solution. Why destroy them when you can profit from their labor? But coexisting with sin always leads to spiritual decline. What they failed to see was that by allowing the Canaanites to remain, they were sowing the seeds of the future corruption. These remaining Canaanites would influence Israel with their idolatry, leading them into spiritual compromise and tragedy. Verse 34, the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Heres, in Aigalon, and in Shalvim. But the land of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akravim from Selah and upward. The tribe of Dan ended up neither driving out the Canaanites nor enslaving them, nor coexisting with them. Instead, they retreated to the hills in fear, unable to claim the land God had promised to them. Ultimately, Israel failed to complete the conquest, and rather than establishing their own borders, they allowed the Canaanites to dictate the boundaries for the territory. The result of halfway faith was compromise that ended up in tragedy. The Canaanites became a thorn in their side for generations. God had warned them. Number 33, God said, "But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will give you trouble in the land where you will live." Dear friends, when we fail to trust God completely, we make the same mistake. We tolerate idols, worldly culture, wrong friendships, pride, sin in our lives, thinking we can manage it. But it slowly entangles us. We compromise our convictions because it seems too hard to resist the pressures of the world. We become content with partial obedience, but it leaves us vulnerable to spiritual defeat. We stop coming to church, we stop reading the Bible, we stop praying, thinking we will be all right. And suddenly we are miles away from God. Compromising with the world and sin is a tragedy. During World War II, one of the most significant turning points was the Allied invasion of Normandy on the date June 6, 1944. It began with the Allies landing on the beaches of northern France. Though it was a small foothold at first, that narrow strip of sand became the launching point for their massive advance across Europe. From that beachhead, they steadily pushed forward, liberating towns and cities, until they eventually reached Berlin and brought about the defeat of Nazi Germany. Now consider this. Sin operates in the same way. It starts with just a small foothold, a seemingly minor compromise, an innocent indulgence, or a slight bending of God's commands. At first, it appears harmless or manageable, like a tiny beachhead on the shore of your heart. But once sin gains even the slightest position, it begins to expand. It advances further, taking more ground, affecting your thoughts, your desires, and your actions. What once seemed like a harmless concession eventually becomes a spiritual stronghold. And before you know it, sin has marched across your entire heart, just as the Allies advanced from Normandy to Berlin. And now, the angel of the Lord, who is Jesus himself before his incarnation, went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, "I brought you up from Egypt. I brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord, who is Jesus himself before his incarnation, spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. And they called the name of that place Bokim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. Bokim literally means weeping ones. And that's a tragedy of compromise. That is the consequence of not obeying God completely. And then God just delivered you to the consequences. Would God eventually forsake his people because of their persistent rebellion, sacrificing his faithfulness? Or will he yield to their disobedience, overlooking their sin, and thereby compromise his holiness? What do you think? If you want to know the answer, don't miss the series Chaos in Self-Ruling.